This week on Hell of a Picture, we enter the turbulence of the 1960s with the World War I character study, Lawrence of Arabia. We open up the show this week by describing how the film embraces the wide range of opinions on Lawrence and how that branches out thematically in the picture. I talk about the scope and the scale of the cinematography, while Dave tells us about some of the film's most famous imitators. Can more than one thing be true? For example, can you have relevant commentary on a film while mispronouncing an actor's name? I'll let you decide. That's this week on Hell of a Picture. Welcome to Hell of a Picture, a weekly movie podcast where we discuss an unforgettable film, and if it truly is a hell of a picture. My name is Andrew Bartlett, and I'm sitting across the internet, as I do each and every week, from the Peter O'Toole to my David Lean, Mr. David Hollingsworth.
I thought you were going to go with Omar Sharif there, and interesting little story about the first time Peter O'Toole met Omar Sharif. They were on set and comes up to him, and Omar introduces himself, and Peter says, "Oh, well, that's a rather silly name. I believe I'll call you Fred." And so he did. Yeah, I know, right?
Wow, all right.
Pretty great.
Peter O'Toole, really appropriate there. So we're talking about Lawrence of Arabia today. I was about to say On the Waterfront, but we're not talking about On the Waterfront. We're talking about Lawrence of Arabia. Hence the David Lean and Peter O'Toole references. Lawrence of Arabia, man, this was a epic if there ever was one. We're continuing our run here of Oscar pictures. We're in the 1960s now, 1962 to be exact, and Lawrence of Arabia, which won Best Picture then. We got some, Lawrence regarded as one of the greatest films ever made, and on multiple lists, and obviously won the Oscar, which is why we are talking about it today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was pretty palms up about this last week. Very excited to talk about this movie. Special place in my heart, and forever will. I think I watching it again. It had been a while, but man, it has lost nothing, and maybe even gained some stuff in my mind.
So I was saying to you earlier that it's been a long time for me since I watched this movie. And I think when I was rewatching it this time around, I was like, I can't remember any of this. And I was maybe getting it confused with like other epics at the time. And just sort of like, it was foggy as to like, if I could remember certain scenes and whatever. And then I was like, yeah, probably saw this as a kid. Like maybe early teens, definitely on TV. And on a TV that's like, the TVs we grow up on, like,
that's right,
20-incher or something like that. You're not really getting the vast scope of it. I watched it on this like a 70-incher now. So it's like, you're watching this, it's a bit of a different experience for sure. But for you said, your dad had introduced you to this film, right?
Yeah. We certainly watched it together for the first time. And so there is that sort of nostalgic, there's a sentimentality to it for me, I think, right, as well, in addition to it. And I'm a bit of a sort of, a recreational history nerd. I love that aspect of it. I also the themes of it are particularly interesting to me, and it's influenced some of the best fiction, speculative fiction that I've read too. The Dune Chronicles are heavily inspired by this. Paul Atreides basically is Lawrence of Arabia, and so the themes of Dune, which I think are seen here as well, are very interesting to me. So it just has a lot going. It's a lot of in my wheelhouse kind of stuff, and so it particularly suited to me. And so I've sort of got a biased opinion towards it because of all those things.
Interesting, yeah, because when we were discussing what movies to do kind of from this decade, there are some options and best pictures, and you were very adamant. Out of all of the best pictures we've selected, Lawrence of Arabia we must discuss. So excited to get into it today.
Pounded the table. Yep.
So yeah, let's start it off. This is obviously one that people have probably not watched in a while. So if you hit us with the rundown and get us up to speed on Lawrence of Arabia.
I will. A very brief synopsis, because boy, 4 hours I could go on. So, T.E. Lawrence is an underutilized and understimulated British lieutenant stationed in Cairo during the First World War. But when the Arab Bureau needs a man to be their eyes and ears in the region, Lawrence is thrust into a role for which he will turn out to be uniquely suited, serving as a diplomatic attaché, a spy, a military strategist, a guerrilla leader, and perhaps even a prophet. Along the way, he will willingly topple one empire and, despite debatable intentions, install another, shaping a region and a multitude of peoples for generations to come. Lawrence of Arabia was released in December of 1962 and directed by David Lean. It stars the then unknown Peter O'Toole as T.E. Lawrence, Obi-Wan Kenobi himself, Mr. Genuine Class, Sir Alec Guinness as Prince Faisal, the one concession to authenticity in casting, Omar Sharif, Fred, as we mentioned, as Sharif Ali, excuse me. And lastly, screen legend Anthony Quinn, who once left a tank top in Central Park while doing sit-ups, as Aouda Abu Tai. Forgive my ignorance on the pronunciation there. Now, the film was predictably dominant at the Academy Awards, winning for picture, director, and all the big ones, outside of acting, weirdly enough. It ranks 7th on the most recent issue of the AFI's Top 100 list, and 3rd on the BFI, that's the British Film Institute's Top 100 as well. Moreover, it is of sacral importance among filmmakers, and it has been cited as inspiration by the likes of George Lucas, Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, Ridley Scott, Denis Villeneuve, and the list goes on and on. Steven Spielberg has called the film a miracle, and his favorite of all time. I prefaced this episode last week by saying the man, T.E. Lawrence, is every bit as sensational as the movie, and perhaps more so. And it could be said that his book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, was more influential than even the film if you consider its audience. Now, this 400,000-word megatome was considered essential reading by North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, who battled both the French and American armies successfully, with Lawrence's work serving as his fighting gospel. I considered taking some more time here to talk about the real Lawrence, but we've got a nearly 4-hour movie to get to, so that is your rundown.
All right, well said. Yeah, unknown. I didn't realize that Peter O'Toole was not really known before this, I guess.
Yeah, well, did you notice in the opening credits, it's like they introduce everybody, like they list everyone else first, and then finally it's and introducing Peter O'Toole as T.E. Lawrence.
Yeah.
So a relative unknown. They looked at a few people. I can't recall the names now. There was some. I think Brando was considered. There was some other people. Alec Guinness was sort of thought about at first as well, but then they decided he was too old. And I think O'Toole was probably maybe sort of 4th or 5th down the list. But once they screen tested him, that was it. Like, no, he's Lawrence. At least for Lean. Lean thought that he was definitively Lawrence. It took some convincing for the producers, but he was adamant, and they got him. So
yeah, he's fantastic here. So let's dive right into this discussion on Lawrence in general and how he is. I mean, he's such a interesting character in that is he a good person? Is he a bad person? He's our hero. He's flawed, right? Like what do we actually know about this character of T.E. Lawrence?
Yeah, well, that's an incisive question there. What do we know? And there's been a lot said and written about Lawrence, and it may be that no one account is wholly descriptive, because the man was a spy, and a damn good one, a genius, in fact. So he understood the value of misinformation. And he was also someone who invited passionate, divisive opinion. And this is something we see right away in the film. It starts out, we're at his funeral, and we're shown that feelings towards him are wide-ranging. And knowing him is rare, maybe even impossible. So this is a brilliant beginning to a film, because not only does it tell us about him, I think it's also instructive on how the film will approach the subject. This is not a one-sided fawning portrait of a hero or of history, which it could be. It is also not a condemnation, which it could also be. I think what I love most about this movie is that it shows the complexity of greatness, and I'm going to use the air quotes there for hopefully the last time ever. But yeah, it deals with complexity of greatness in people and in history, both in terms of those who are vessels for it and the fallout of their actions, which is really important. It is as unflinching a view of the subject as I've ever seen, and it's steadfast in its contention that more than one thing can be true.
Yeah. I mean, I love how you bring up that opening scene because it's like, they're walking out of the church and the guy's like, oh, he was such a terrible. I'm sorry, are you talking about T. Lawrence? Like, did you meet him? Did you know? No, I had the pleasure of shaking his hand once. Like,
That's right.
like that's, like nobody really even knows this guy. And that's, yeah, it makes him so interesting. He's such a great leading character. And that's what makes a great leading character, is a flawed one, but it's not one that's like, you know, flawed in a sense of like a bad person. Completely. It's like every character has flaws, but this isn't a case of an actual like bad person thinking they're good, which is what we've seen a lot. Or, this is an interesting case of someone that seems human in their choices and human in how people perceive them, but for all the good and for the bad. I think what backs up the case for Lawrence is his sort of his self-awareness.
Yes.
I found it very compelling that after, the scene where he first crosses the desert, and he goes back and he saves the guy, kind of the guy left behind. It's like he has to end up killing that guy. And, and it's like when he's going back to the, after he gets caught and whatever, and he's doing a debrief with the British after, and you could see how torn up he was. And the brilliance wasn't in that, the fact that he was upset about killing the man. Like that would have been sort of enough. That would have been like, oh, you have to like kill this person that he had to stop the kind of the war or whatever, the two sides from fighting. But he was upset because he acknowledged or realized, it was self-awareness, that he actually enjoyed it. And he's like, I'm bloodthirsty. He's like, I want to do it more. And that's where we see the flawedness. And you're like, oh, okay. So he knows if he's going to go down this route, then it's going to lead to some dicey decisions.
Yeah, that's right. And he's not flawed like Bogart was in Casablanca. He's not just hung up on a dame and he's drunk and he's a little disenchanted. And like you just said, there's an acknowledged contradiction in him. And he says in that same scene, he's like, I can't go back. And then like moments later, he's like, of course I'm going back. What I mean? Right. So like he is a contradictory figure. And, he's kind of clumsy and awkward. And, and people see him as this kind of effete fellow who's too clever by half. And he seems about the least likely person ever to lead a revolt until you get to understand him a little bit, his resolve and his brilliance. And, another idea the film explores through Lawrence, which you brought up already, is the double-edged sword of our actions. He goes back to save Gassim, like you said, the man who's fallen behind in their journey across the sun's anvil. And even though this is celebrated as an act of pure heroism, it has fallout, because Gassim will eventually kill another guy, who, right. And that threatens to break apart this coalition that they've assembled. So in order to placate both parties, Lawrence has to execute Gassim himself. And this touches on the notion of destiny in the film, and whether things are preordained or to be written, which is, an important thought when it comes to greatness and history. But I think just as importantly, it makes us confront the idea that our involvement in things we don't fully understand can make matters worse, regardless of how well-intentioned we might be. Yeah. Ottoman rule, stepping back a moment to talk about the larger sort of scale of the story, like Ottoman rule was not good for the Arabs, but supplanting the Turks with Europeans didn't do them any favors either. And that is what eventually will happen. Lawrence may have been sincere in his hope for Arab liberation and self-rule, but he also may have known, and probably did know, that the Sykes-Picot Agreement or something like it was coming. And so like this lesson of non-intervention is one that we can see played out a lot in history and in recent history. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Basically, any time you get involved in another country's business, it seems to go awry.
Yeah, it really does seem to go awry, for sure. And and then this film that's over 60 years old, 70 years old now. Well, I'm doing the math. 40, no, 60, over 60 years old.
Yeah.
It's
old.
It displays, yeah, it's old. It displays that concept for sure. But it's one thing that hasn't seemed to change or evolve, and like you said, getting involved in other countries' affairs, and we see that from Lawrence as the film progresses. As I mentioned, with him worrying about becoming bloodthirsty, that scene. There's also a evolution or foreshadowing from that, and that comes to fruition, at the very end of the film with that iconic "No prisoners." Moment. Some would argue the most iconic moment of the film, right? And you can see his torment and his pain in that struggle, but he's giving into what he feared he would become, and that's what the whole film is building towards, and that's his greatness, quotation. So as you mentioned, on display. No prisoners.
That's right. Yeah, we do see that erosion of his spirit over time, as you described, and the toll that war takes on a person. One question that is asked of Lawrence throughout the movie is why. Why is he doing this? Is it for the Arabs? Is it for England? Is it for Lawrence? Is he driven by morals, by duty, or by vanity? And I feel the answer is yeah. It can be all of that, because he is a contradictory man, and that is sort of the point here. And I think he genuinely loves Arabia and understands it better than most Westerners, but he still views it with that lens of Orientalism. Like when that scene where he's given the robes by Ali, he's very respectful, and he asks first, is it permitted for him to make the salam gesture before he goes ahead and does it, but then he rides out and he's alone, and there's kind of this giddiness to him, and he sort of capers about for a moment like he's playing dress up in the robes, and he's swirling it about, and so he can recognize the solemnity of things and still see it all as a bit of a game. And we can also see how he craves acclaim. Like he is a bit of an exhibitionist, but he's also uneasy with aspects of it. Like he'll stand triumphantly on the train in front of his troops. Well, they chant for him, but yet he's also clearly uncomfortable with rank and favor. So he is really this exemplar of complexity, of greatness and history. And he can be a war hero and a war criminal, as you described. More than one thing can be true.
So when we look at Lean, and sort of his role and how he decided to depict Lawrence throughout the film, it's pretty amazing. Not just with the story, but with how he uses the setting of the film, to kind of get all these ideas across about, being a war hero and a war criminal, all these things to kind of get across Lawrence's emotional arc of the film. We get these, that's why the film is 4 hours long, because it's not a story you can tell in 90 minutes or even 2 hours or even 3 hours. You need time to let these shots sink in. You have these long sweeping shots of the desert, and he shoots in 70 millimeter print, which is capturing this massive image that allows for these grand, vast landscapes to be captured. It feels huge in scale and in concept. Nothing like this is created nowadays, hasn't been created since movies like this. And I'm just captivated by how big the movie feels. And this relates to how we were talking about the digital age of film with way back when we were talking about Jurassic Park. That sort of transition. With a film like this, there's texture to it. There's realism and authenticity, not just with with the story, but then with the actual how they decided to film it. And that can't be digitized. that can't be recreated. There's shots where characters, like you see these shots of the horizon and like this little tiny it's Lawrence on the camel kind of riding towards the camera.
Mm-hmm.
There's these wide vast shots of sort of the his group of the army or whatever with guys like way off in the distance, but you can see all these little kind of dots of them, like these extras. It's endless extras that look like they're miles away, scattered throughout the scene. The film does feel long and dragged out at times, but as I said, that's sort of for the emotional arc of the story to play out. It allows us to take in every grain of sand, every tiny little extra, every aspect of every frame. And that's obviously very intentional by Lean.
Yeah, and that scale, that size, it applies to time as well as just the scope of the desert, and even to the enormity of the task. And I think history as a concept, we're kind of like these little sort of dots in history. You know what I mean? We are so insignificant in the grand sort of narrative, and because of all that, we genuinely appreciate how long it takes them to cross that, that uncrossable expanse of desert. It feels so earned by the time we reach the other side. And like, I have to say, like, I still think this is a more beautiful film than just about anything I've seen shot with modern technology. More, maybe Dune 2 sort of starts to approach it, but I don't know, man. Some of the landscapes in this are just so incredible, particularly in that first act when they're looking for Prince Faisal. Man, there's just some wild stuff. There's that one shot where you see like this sort of camel baggage train going across the horizon as the sun is setting behind it, and you're just pulled way back, and you linger in this shot for what's got to be coming up on 30 seconds. And I could go for another 30. It's just so beautiful, and I love the sustained look at the landscapes and what that gives you as a viewer. I really can't say enough about it. You're awed and you feel small watching it.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's like when you're taking all this in, the crispness of it, and like how sharp it is, and it's, you sort of are blown away that this was shot 60 plus years ago, as we were saying. It's so beautifully shot. But there's a ton of different influences on this film. We see that carry through. You mentioned earlier Villeneuve, Spielberg, Kubrick. The list goes on and on. I couldn't help but notice when I was watching this, we talked a lot about Spielberg, but it's like all I could see was Indiana Jones, and not just Indiana Jones in like Raiders. It was like, it was in Raiders. It was from like Temple of Doom. There was Last Crusade. Obviously, there's all these influences on that's from Indiana Jones with this film. I will say another interesting little tidbit was tidbit. I said tinbit. Tidbit. Interesting tidbit would be
it's a plug for Tim Hortons. If they want to sponsor us, we are open to that. We
right.
will call it Timbit forever.
Ridiculous. So you mentioned Spielberg. This has been like his favorite movie. Spielberg is my favorite movie, as I've been mentioned on this podcast numerous times, is The Goonies. The story was actually written by Steven Spielberg. The screenplay was written by Chris Columbus, and it was directed by Richard Donner. But anyways, the story was by Spielberg for The Goonies, and one of the main characters in The Goonies is, everybody knows him, is Chunk. Do the truffle shuffle, the joyful little kid, loves, who hangs out with Sloth.
Mm-hmm.
In the movie, his actual name is Lawrence. Yeah.
Yes, I remember now. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he gets referenced. He gets called Chunk, obviously, throughout the whole movie, but the cop calls him Lawrence, and that, like, when he's on the phone with the cops, it's like, is this Lawrence again? He was like, oh, I'm telling the truth, and whatever. And it's like, so his actual name, Chunk's name is Lawrence. And I was like, oh, obviously, yeah.
Well, you bring up Indiana Jones too, and the connection is even stronger there actually because it's not discussed in this movie because they don't have the goddamn time. But like Lawrence's formative years were he was basically Indiana Jones. He was an archaeologist. That's why he had
Oh,
been.
wow.
That's why he had been to Damascus and he had been to this region and he understood these tribes and these people and could speak a little bit of Arabic and
You get a
understood the
little bit of
Quran.
that at the very beginning when
Yeah, a
he's sort
little
of in
bit.
the, like, you're like, oh, he's sort of, because when they're sort of deciding to send him, it's like, well, why him?
Hmm.
Well, it's like, well, he's a odd fellow that has, he's smart and he can, whatever the reasoning they give. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, yeah, he was basically Indiana Jones. So he it's just he's such an interesting dude and like yeah, his early years they talk about his bastardy and stuff, like stuff like that, his illegitimacy
mhm.
but yeah, his childhood and his sort of school and university years are pretty interesting too. And he was a rad dude, man. Like in so many ways. I really do encourage people to go and to look up some information and on the either read or listen to a podcast on the real Lawrence because man, he was freaking fascinating.
Yeah, he certainly was. I also like how you sort of mentioned Dune, and like we talked about Dune in our little two-parter in-person episode a while back. Be sure to go back and listen to that. But
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
Paul Atreides, like this is the Messiah character. There's even shots in Lawrence of Arabia. I'm thinking of the shot where he's in the white robe and he's standing over everybody with his arms up.
Yeah.
It's like this Messiah godlike figure to these people, and they're following him. It's like you said, it just screams Paul Atreides.
Absolutely. And this is another sort of I mean, the truth of the way he was viewed by the Arabs is kind of debatable. Like
Mm-hmm.
yes, like he was revered and honored as a great as a great warrior and stuff like that.
The actual person
Did
you're talking about,
yeah,
yeah,
but like did
yeah,
he fall like did they view him in that way? Maybe not exactly. Maybe that's again part of sort of the sensationalizing of him, and maybe partly the way he's sort of chosen to describe and remember it, or that. But again, like this is sort of part of what the film discusses as it relates to history. Like
right,
where is the truth in it? Is there bits of everything? And so like yeah, I mean the Paul connection is so strong, and the what we should really abstract from the history of Lawrence and what the movie conveys as well is so much of what is in Dune. And you know like we talked about in that episode, Frank Herbert was not a fan of the charismatic leader, the prophet, or
that's
the
right,
Messiah. He did not care for
right,
it. Paul, though he is ostensibly the hero, is not meant to be idolized, and it
right.
is the idolatry of Paul that is sort of part of the problem. And so yeah, the complexity of heroes and prophets and messiahs, government intervention, colonialism, imperialism, all these ideas, Orientalism, they all pop up in this and are also discussed to great effect in the works of Herbert and Dune. And they sort of came about concurrently, like the movie, like because this movie comes out in '62. Herbert releases the first book, I think, in '65, but he started writing it obviously some years beforehand. So he would have been more directly influenced, I would say, by the actual history of T.E.
Correct, right.
Lawrence. But then afterwards, I would say, as it progressed, because he continued to write, I'm sure he took something from the film as well, because it has something of its own to offer in addition to the history.
Absolutely, and we can see that in Nolan's films, and even with something like Oppenheimer, right? Like,
Mm,
I know it's not. I said Nolan as in Nolan directed Dune, even though it was Villeneuve, but I meant,
yeah.
just, yeah, I just meant no. Like we see that in the modern films, I guess is what my point, right?
Hmm.
With something like Oppenheimer, right? The Dune films, the flawed leading character again. That's how we started the podcast, and Oppenheimer being a flawed main character, and sort of this, Nolan just getting that inspiration from, like, even shooting on 70 and
Hmm.
or shooting. I guess he was shooting like IMAX, but like the 70 film stock, and it's just It's obviously such an influential film, and that's clear throughout cinema history. So, we're getting to the end of the podcast here. We have a question that we ask every week. David, is Lawrence of Arabia for you a hell of a picture?
Well, I don't think there was really much question here. Very briefly, yes. I am open to the idea that this is the greatest movie ever made. The
Wow.
cinematography, the locations, what they must have gone through to make the film was great. I would like to do a whole nother podcast just talking about the production and what it must have been like to shoot this,
Yeah,
because this is all in the desert, like
yeah,
in the
we touched
freaking
on it
desert.
briefly, but yeah.
Yeah, but there's just not enough time in the day. So I'd like to do almost another episode of that. But the number of extras, the horses, the camels, it's immense. The ideas it addresses, for my money, are some of the more interesting and important in history. The subject of the film is perfect for that. I love T.E. Lawrence. I love Peter O'Toole's portrayal of him. It is
Right.
so damn good. I love it. I love it. I love it. Hell of a picture. Absolutely.
Wow, this might be the most hell of a picture for you.
I think it
Yeah,
probably is. Yeah.
for me, it's not I'm not obviously as big a history buff as you are. But I think for the sheer importance of this film alone, it's a hell of a picture. The sort of the questionable things about the movie, like the length, 4 hours pretty much. The somewhat questionable casting, that's nowadays is sort of not really sort of frowned upon. You think about some of the choices, and just various depictions, but it is such an important film, and I think it led to a lot of great inspiration from this, and yeah, it's worthy of a hell of a picture, and it's worthy of its accolades. So it getting Best Picture certainly deserved it, and I think Peter O'Toole definitely deserves the Best Actor, even though he lost out to Gregory Peck for To Kill a Mockingbird. So yeah, not I don't want to say surprising, because that's obviously an incredible performance and great film too. But Lawrence of Arabia, man, another hell of a picture, and worth a revisit. Even talking about it beforehand, I sort of said to you, um, I probably don't have to revisit this movie anytime in the next 10 to 20 years. But even after discussing it with you today, I'm like, man, I'd like to go back and watch a couple of those scenes again, And like, I would say there's to close out, I was reading some articles on it, and I read this really interesting article. I wish I knew the author. It's this kind of a film critic who writes for RogerEbert.com, and he kind of told the story of when he flew to LA to see a 70 mil print screening of this film, and it was like he just kind of told that story, and it's like, yeah, being able to go to a theater, a 70 millimeter theater that can project this, and like that would be a crazy experience. You could really see everything. That's like watching Lawrence of Arabia in IMAX is pretty much what it is. But it would be a wild experience. So anyway,
yeah, I would put down my money to do that, and not think twice about it. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. It's like this guy like bought a ticket, lived in Houston, flew to LA for a one night screening so he could see this in 70 mil. So it's like,
hell yeah,
that's pretty awesome.
Hell yeah. No, I love it.
So yeah, there's another Best Picture winner. We're jumping into the 70s next week. And man, we got another banger, David. Do you want to we had a lot to choose from for this, for the 70s. So do you want to let everybody know what we're going to be discussing next week on Hell of a Picture?
Yeah, we had to whittle it down from a very long short list, but we ultimately settled on The Deer Hunter.
Yes.
It will be my first time watching The Deer Hunter. I think I've seen bits of it. I have sort of flashes of some POW stuff. Maybe I don't know if that's accurate in any way, but
Certainly
I think
is.
yeah. Okay, so I think I think I've seen maybe some snippets of it, and but it will feel like the first time, I'm sure. But you have seen this, of course, and
Yeah.
you've been pretty excited to talk about it.
Oh man, I'm super stoked for this. I love this movie so much, and it's been a few years since I watched it. Um, and man, I've already watched it in preparation for next week. I'm gonna rewatch it a second time because it's so good. And yeah, and there's a lot to grab from this film, and I think it's very fitting coming after Lawrence of Arabia. You know, when you were talking about sort of going into various places unprompted, I guess, invading certain areas of the world, and this film is, you know, a film about Vietnam and, you know,
Right.
about American, you know, influence there, and sort of it's a effect on people, you know, and not just soldiers, but also just like, you know, the people that know the soldiers kind of thing. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's a pretty amazing film. So I'm very excited to talk about that next week. Uh, so yeah, that's we got the Dare Hunter next week. We did Lawrence of Arabia, and man, we just keep this Oscar train going. And so for David Hollinshurst, my name is Andrew Bartlett. This has been another episode of Hell of a Picture.